Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of the Inner Realm podcast. Now, even though the podcast is titled An Atheist Prayer, my initial title, or the alternative title, let's say, is Why Asking What Does God Want Me to Do is a good question, even if you're not religious. Now, obviously, that's a terrible, terrible title, which is why I changed it to Atheist Prayer. But pretty much what I want to make today is the case as to why it's important to pray and to even believe in God, even if you intellectually think God doesn't exist. Um, Firstly, I want to, have a bit of a caveat that since this is the first episode of the Inner Realm podcast, but also because I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes. You know, in this, it's not edited like I'd normally do with a video. Therefore, full disclosure, as you can see here, I'm clearly using a script. I can't sort of go off the cuff and kind of just casually comment on these matters, especially things that I myself don't even know what I think. A part of doing this is to flesh out my ideas and make sense of this. But this is something, this idea of let's call it a Christian atheist or a believing atheist is something that has really stuck on my mind for a while. Not just my mind, it's something I've really been thinking about. I would even say wrestling with for the past couple of years, actually. Part of it is because of my own story with religion, particularly Christianity. But anyway, before I get to my anecdotes and my whole testimony, not in the religious sense, I just mean talking about my story. A good question, I guess, like a good introductory question to ask is modern society really getting secular? I don't think so. I think that point that Pascal famously made, there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each man, which cannot be satisfied by any created thing, but only by God the Creator. I'm reading off the quote. This quote here, I think it is true. It is very existentially true, psychologically true, true in every sense of what that word could mean. Look, I don't have to go into detail about this. I think people are sort of sick of hearing about all the social media anger and all the political polarization. Like polarization is it's a new fancy word, much like unprecedented when the pandemic came along, and it seems like mostly what people talk about these days is the divide in the media, the distrust in our institutions, but for me, I think yes, those layers of conversation are important. It's important to explore at that level, let's say, but we have to go to something more fundamental. We have to move to something that I believe is the essence of the human psyche at the minimum, and at the maximum, I don't even know. Maybe it's even metaphysically true, even though in this video, I don't want to make these metaphysical claims. I'm just going to speak firstly from my subjective point of view, but also in a very, very existential sense, because in many ways, that's the most intense and relevant way to look at the world, for me at least. It's just very pertinent to our being, our existence, pretty much. So yes, I mean, the thing is, I think we society isn't getting secular in the truest sense. Like we aren't becoming these let's say a Nietzschean post-God society where we can kind of live this passionate Nietzschean life and take upon this Nietzschean burden and carry it with ardor and with courage and boldness and with that absolute will to power. I don't think that can happen. I think Nietzsche was wrong there. Actually, an interesting thing, this is even a point I think Carl Jung made in his lectures on Zarathustra. Anyway, I don't want to go too much off track here. So yeah, I think we human beings, firstly, we're terrible at creating. Well, yeah, I shouldn't say terrible, because after all, human beings are meaning-making machines. But I shouldn't have said that word. No, I don't want to say machines. I don't like thinking of human beings as machines. Meaning-making beings. But at the same time, this meaning isn't in the sort of subjective sense that we view it. I think there's something beyond the subjective. There's something, let's call it a trans-subjective experience, because I don't even know if the word is objective really. And it's in this experience that the world makes sense to us. Things like beauty make sense to us, and it's at this level, at this transpersonal, trans-subjective level, we need a something, and I think that can only be, in essence, something divine, something like God. Even though the word God itself is a very convoluted term, we need something like that to fill. Yes, I'd say fill the hole, the way Pascal would put it. Therefore, no, society isn't getting secular, and I think we can never really be secular. Look, I've heard arguments by Brett Weinstein. Sorry, is it Brett Weinstein or Brett Weinstein? I keep screwing that up. Anyway, Brett Weinstein, the evolutionary biologist, and even Richard Dawkins. Is Brett Weinstein an evolutionary biologist? Anyway, the biologist Brett Weinstein and Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, the atheist, talk about memes and how this religious meme, which Richard Dawkins believes is a parasite in his opinion, but he at least acknowledges that there is something there. So it's that fundamental if you're a complete materialist. Anyway, I'm getting carried away again. Let's first try to understand what I mean by God. I don't think. Well, hold on. That wasn't the intent behind this. I didn't wanna elucidate what I mean by God. Let's try and first get to something that I want to discuss, which I call the identity crisis. So I don't know why I said let's first understand what I mean by God, because I definitely haven't got an answer yet. I don't even know what I mean by God when I say it. It's just a word for me. However, I'm going to talk about a disagreement that I have with, let's say, Protestantism. So this saved by faith dogma of Protestantism, this idea that you declare in Jesus Christ, John 2:16, and you declare and you believe in your heart, and then you're saved. And then your life is complete. You found your identity in Christ. You found your identity in God. Everything is whole. Everything is full. And it's it. It's the end of history, to be a bit Hegelian. Like you're good. Like there's no more to life than being saved. I mean, of course there is practically, but I guess in a more spiritual and existential sense, there's no more once one is saved and one's in relationship with God. Now, I don't know if I agree with this. I'm not a Protestant. I think I'm more of a absurdist Christian. I can get into what that is a bit later. I think this identity crisis that we all have, this constant struggle of trying to figure out who we are, trying to figure out our place in the world, but also, in some sense, this incongruence we feel in the world. There's this constant, I guess, to be Camusian about it, to try and find meaning in a meaningless world. This crisis, this is a crisis that a theist and a atheist, I think, goes through. I think anybody, people go through this even unconsciously. People haven't got a word for it, but we all go through this crisis. We're all trying to make sense of this absurd world, and of course, people respond to this in different ways. Some good, some bad. Nevertheless, the point being, people always go through this. So, for me, the saved by faith dogma, what I don't like about it is that it's kind of too absolutist for me. It's too totalitarian is a bit of a harsh word. It's too final. I don't view the world in that sense. Therefore, this idea of an identity crisis, once you find Christ, it goes away. I don't think that's true. As a matter of fact, this is the next point I want to make, but I'll get to it. I think what happens when one is a Christian, when one believes in God or acts like one believes in God, is one could actually have an authentic identity crisis. I'll hold on to that, but I'll explain what I mean by that. But on the topic of the identity crisis, I always want to say, this is a bit of an ancillary point. You know, this idea of going through an identity crisis, this is a very real thing. This isn't something that should be trivial. This isn't something that should be, kind of like this, it's a phenomenon for like modern people, like these modern privileged, let's say Westerners who've got nothing else to do but to question their identity. So like if we take the LGBTQ plus whatever that is community, the crisis that they're going through, it is not something, it angers me. It actually breaks my heart that it's something that is politicized, that these members of these groups are treated like political abstractions. I think that's an absolute sin. That's a terrible, terrible moral shortcoming of our society. Because, if these individuals in these groups are genuinely going through this gender crisis, which is a type of identity crisis, that is something that should be taken seriously, because that is a part of the human condition. So it is no trivial thing, and it shouldn't be sort of sneered at or contemptuously dismissed as a result of just being privileged. Which is why I'm going to make the statement or the claim that if one truly wants to go through an authentic crisis, let's say, one should believe in God. Here's what I mean by that. First of all, when one goes through a identity crisis, there's something about one's identity. I don't think identity is just this atomistic, individual, detached thing. I think identity is much more deeper than that. At least to be a bit more practical about this, let's say, at least part of our identity is how we interrelate amongst other members in our social group. We get part of our identity from society, from our community. And that's at a very superficial level looking at this. But I think identity is a much more deeper thing than merely something that happens internally, which is why I'm not a whole fan of this whole, self-love and self-centered, let's say, movement in the West, in the modern West. So when I mean being a Christian, let's say, or being a believer and acting like God exists, is your identity crisis. It's not nothing. Your life then, your crisis itself isn't some trivial thing that's happening to this insignificant speck of dust in this tiny planet, this pale blue dot, the way Carl Sagan puts it, where who gives a shit if you're going through a damn identity crisis? Fuck off. I don't give a shit. You're just another human being going through a crisis. I don't care. But in that, let's say, that leap of faith, that Kierkegaardian leap of faith, where one acts and really takes that leap into believing in God, the moment that happens, there's this divine connection between us, a finite mortal being, and the infinite, and in some sense, our identity crisis, to use a Paul Tillich term, becomes a part of our ultimate concern. So one's individual identity crisis becomes something ultimate. And I do believe that, let's again, speak at a social level. If people truly understood this, this idea, let's say in the Old Testament, of being made in the image of God, or this idea that every single human being has a speck of divinity in them, there's something divine to humanity, we will not trivialize something like an identity crisis into mere politics. We will not trivialize it to play mere power games. We'll take it seriously, and hopefully, what I mean by taking it seriously is not in like a pompous, way, but rather treat each other with love. I know that's like a cliche, but I truly mean it, that we embrace each other's collective struggle, let's say, and we understand that this is something real. We truly empathize with every single human being going through this. And look, I would say I first heard this idea of Christian Atheism by Slavoj Žižek. Now, I found this very interesting because Žižek is, as a materialist, he makes a much more radical claim. You know, he doesn't really go much into the whole identity crisis thing that I touched on. But even he does touch on the fact that in some sense the authentic way to understand the responsibility of being human is through being a Christian. Now, before I get to his point, let me first play this video by Žižek in his movie Pervert's Guide to Ideology, and then I'm gonna go through this essay that he wrote. Oh well, not the whole essay, just a snippet from it. Oh, sorry, I did forget to talk about this point here. I would say one other reason I do like about Žižek's idea of Christian atheism is because, I hear a lot of, let's say, evangelical Christians or just cultural Christians talk about this conservative argument that, our society is made on Christian principles. The bedrock of us, the bedrock of our society is Christianity. Therefore, we shouldn't just jettison this religion away. We're gonna live in a Nietzschean hell after the death of God. Look, I totally get the point they're trying to make. I don't want to dismiss it. I think if we take our society seriously, if we want society to be, whoa! I just totally missed the word that I'm looking for. Let me just Google it. Intact. Sorry. If we want society to be intact, we shouldn't just casually dismiss that argument. Even if you make the sort of pragmatic argument for Christianity or Christian culture, I could see that. However, the reason I like Žižek's argument is because I think he goes one step further, because he isn't a mere pragmatist. He's more of a romantic, continental philosopher. And by him going more further, I do believe if it's truly understood the point he's trying to make, at an individual level, it's more heartfelt. It's more heartfelt than a practical, pragmatic argument. One should be a Christian, or one should live by Christian values because it's good for society. It's a bit too utilitarian, for me at least. But anyway, saying that, let me get back to Žižek's video. So, yeah, this clip right here is from the Pervert's Guide to Ideology. Wow, I'm saying ideology like Žižek. And just listen to this. It's done so well.
I think makes Christianity an exception. It all began with the book of Job. As we all know, things turned out bad for Job. He loses everything: his house, his family, his possessions, and so on. 3 friends visit him, and each of them tries to justify Job's misfortunes. The greatness of Job is that he does not accept this deeper meaning. When, towards the end of the book of Job, God himself appears, God gives right to Job. He says everything that the theological friends were telling Job is false, everything Job was saying is true. No meaning in catastrophes. Here we have the first step in the direction of delegitimizing suffering.
Father, stay with me. Don't leave me.
The contrast between Judaism and Christianity is the contrast between anxiety and love. The idea is that the Jewish God is the God of the abyss of the other's desire. Terrible things happen, God is in charge, but we do not know what the big other God wants from us, what is the divine desire. To designate this traumatic experience, Lacan used the Italian phrase "che vuoi?" What do you want? This terrifying question, but what do you want from me? The idea is that Judaism persists in this anxiety, like God remains this enigmatic, terrifying other. And then Christianity resolves the tension through love. By sacrificing his son, God demonstrates that he loves us. So it's a kind of an imaginary, sentimental, even resolution of a situation of radical anxiety.
Forgive them.
If this were to be the case, then Christianity would have been kind of ideological reversal or pacification of the deep, much more shattering Jewish insight. But I think one can read the Christian gesture in a much more radical way. This is what the sequence of crucifixion in Scorsese's film shows us. What dies on the cross is precisely this guarantee of the big other. The message of Christianity is here radically atheist. It's the death of Christ is not any kind of redemption or commercial affair in the sense of Christ suffers to pay for our sins, pay to whom, for what, and so on. It's simply the disintegration of the God which guarantees the meaning of our lives. And that's the meaning of that famous phrase, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Father, why have you forsaken me?
Father! Why have you forsaken me?
Just before Christ's death, we get what in psychoanalytic terms we call subjective destitution. Stepping out totally of the domain of symbolic identification. Canceling or suspending the entire field of symbolic authority, the entire field of the big other. Of course, we cannot know what God wants from us because there is no God. This is the Jesus Christ who says, among other things, I bring sword, not peace. If you don't hate your father, your mother, you are not my follower. Of course, this doesn't mean that you should actively hate or kill your parents. I think that family relations stand here for hierarchic social relations. The message of Christ is, I'm dying, but my death itself is good news. It means you are alone, left to your freedom, be in the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, which is just the community of believers. It's wrong to think that the second coming will be that Christ as a figure will return somehow. Christ is already here when believers form an emancipatory collective. This is why I claim that the only way really to be an atheist is to go through Christianity. Christianity is much more atheist than the usual atheism, which can claim there is no God and so on, but nonetheless it retains a certain trust into the big other. This big other can be called natural necessity, evolution, or whatever. We humans are nonetheless reduced to a position within a harmonious whole of evolution, whatever. But the difficult thing to accept is, again, that there is no big other, no point of reference which guarantees meaning.
Yes, I don't know if any of that made sense. It took me a couple of times to watch that clip. However, I think... Whoops. However, I think this essay that Žižek wrote a two-part essay. It's called Only a Suffering God Can Save Us. He has a part on Kierkegaard, actually section 2 is on Kierkegaard and section 1 is on Hegel. Now, I had to read this. I think I read this about 10 times, both essays, because Žižek obviously is a very, very dense, philosopher to read and understand. And there was one paragraph in particular which I think sort of, I don't want to say summarize the whole essay, but it's the gist of at least the point that I'm trying to make here. He makes it so brilliantly. So let me read that paragraph out. It goes like this. This brings us to the third position, above and beyond the first two. The sovereign God, the finite God. That of a suffering God, not a triumphalist God who always wins at the end, although his ways are mysterious, since he secretly pulls all the strings. Not a God who exerts cold justice, since he is by definition always right, but a God who, like the suffering Christ on the cross, is agonized, assumes the burden of suffering in solidarity with the human misery. It was already Schelling who wrote, God is a life, not a mere being. But all life has a fate and is subject to suffering and becoming. Without the concept of a humanly suffering God, or humanely suffering God, let's say, all of history remains incomprehensible. Why? Because God's suffering implies that he is involved in history, affected by it, not just a transcendent master pulling the strings from above. God's suffering means that human history is not just a theater of shadows, but the place of the real struggle, the struggle in which the absolute itself is involved and its fate is decided. This last bit is the point that really spoke to me deeply, because I think it's this last bit, what I mean, is the part that I guess I'm touching on, when I mean that if one wants to go through an authentic identity crisis, a truly beyond the subjective, let's say, one has to become a Christian, or one has to believe in God, because as it says here very clearly, it says here, God's suffering means what happens to Christ on the cross, that human history is not just a theater of shadows, but the place of the real struggle, of the real crisis, of the real identity crisis, of the real existential angst, the struggle in which the absolute itself is involved and its fate is decided. I kind of want to, what's interesting here is, Dostoevsky famously said that, when God is dead, all is permitted. But what Žižek makes is completely the contrary point, because he says, no. Because God is dead, it is not true that all things are permitted. Because God is dead, we have this tremendous, unbearable, soul-crushing responsibility, or a proper word is burden, to carry. This. Therefore, think about this. Because God died, whatever was divine, whatever it was that divinity did, or whatever burden God carried, we have to carry it now. So in some sense, we need to do God's work. Now, these aren't mere narrativized, these aren't mere literary ideas. If you truly, reflect on that and sort of meditate on that, think of what that means for an individual human being. Think of what that means to our lives, to carrying that burden. I don't think we can take that kind of pressure. And I'm not making a mere Marxist, religion is the opioid for the masses claim here. But what I'm saying is, when one takes that leap of faith and one sort of connects or very, very experientially becomes a part of the divine, and even act like God exists, I'll be the first to admit that, God's never spoken to me. I've never had any transcendent experiences. Nothing. I would say I've had spiritual experiences, but nothing in the sense of like God talking to me or like what you'd hear maybe at a charismatic church. Saying that I don't want to dismiss the personal experiences of individuals either. But what I'm saying is, even though I haven't had anything that conspicuous in my life, not just conceptually, but even existentially, I truly act like God exists. I pray. I do all these practices that a believer would do. I question. I ask from being what's required of me. What do I have to do? And really what I'm doing here is I'm actually doing what Žižek said, but the opposite of it. Because Žižek said the authentic way to becoming an atheist is to Christianity. I'm saying the authentic way to become a Christian is to being an atheist. Like one accepts what atheism means, like really accepts it in one's life, and then one takes that leap of faith and believes in God nevertheless. And look, the latter worked for me. I don't think I'm an atheist anymore. Even though I don't go to church, I actually, no offense to any churchgoers, I kind of dislike church rather vehemently. It seems all like a persona to me. Anyway, we're not going to go there. And this is where we'll probably get into a bit of Pascal's wager. Now, Pascal's wager has been, it's got quite a bad rep. It's got quite a bad rep, I guess, amongst the religious, let's say, existentialists, for being inauthentic, for not being genuine or sincere. And it's also, but look, it's also used a lot as, like, logicians use it in probability theory. But I'm not going to really talk about that, or decision theory or whatever. My goal with understanding Pascal's wager is, once again, existential, how it relates to our life. And, I was kind of reading about it, and I found a really good description of maybe like a rebuke to one of the attacks on Pascal's wager, that it isn't sincere, it isn't genuine. It is this. It says that we find two main pieces of advice to the non-believer here. Act like a believer and suppress those passions that are obstacles to becoming a believer. And these are actions that one can perform at will. Believing in God is presumably one way to wager for God. This passage suggests... Sorry, I need some water. This passage suggests that even the non-believer can wager for God by striving to become a believer. I guess, I don't know if this... maybe this is what I mean by that leap of faith, by actually striving to become a believer, actually not even worrying about abstract philosophy and theology or apologetics, let's say, but rather actually orienting oneself as if God exists and kind of striving and living like God exists. And maybe a bit later on I'll get into practically how I do this, at least. But anyway, sorry, getting back to this paragraph. Over here, critiques may question the psychology of belief formation that Pascal presupposes, pointing out that one could strive to believe, perhaps by following exactly Pascal's prescription, yet fail. To this, a follower of Pascal might reply that the act of genuine striving already displays pureness of heart that God would fully reward, or even that genuine striving in this case is itself a form of believing. And this is kind of interesting, the genuine striving idea. Jordan Peterson talks about how Israel means wrestling with God. So definitely, the book of Job being probably the most famous case, probably being the most well-known book in the Bible, where it relates to this struggle with God, truly trying to, understand what the hell is God up to. Therefore, that for me, that is authentic, that is genuine, which is why sometimes I'm not a fan of the whole, I feel like I'm being very, very critical of the church here. The reason for that is because I truly want to get to what is authentic, what is sincere, not even what is true particularly, because what the hell, what do we know about what's true? I guess what we do know, though, is what is untrue, and we do know very much when we are inauthentic, when we do something insincere. We really feel it in our gut. And a good defense of Pascal's wager for me, again, this is definitely connected to the title of this video, the idea of, acting like God exists, because we kind of are wagering in that case for God, is this something John Vervaeke talks about. He talks about these things called psychotechnologies and these practices, things like meditation, things like mindfulness training, where in some sense we would like to think of ourselves like this central processing unit, and we have this abstract being, and that's how we exist in the world. So we have ideas and we have thoughts, and those thoughts then merely imbue action. But people like John Vervaeke, who is a cognitive scientist, his cognitive science, he talks about the what is it? I keep forgetting what this is called. The 4E cognition. Let me just pull it up. Sorry. Yep, here we go. Let me just share my screen. John Vervaeke's 4P3R meta theory of cognition, and the part that I really like about his theory is where is it? Yeah, the 4Ps are participatory knowing, perspectival knowing, procedural knowing, and then there's propositional knowing. So I guess a lot of what I'm doing here is propositional knowing, because all I'm doing is making propositions and statements. But then procedural would be how to do something, how to build a house, how to fix a bike. And then perspectival would be, I think it's, the way I think about it is empathy and being able to see things in context and being able to see things from different points of views. I don't think that's merely like a logical propositional thing either. I think it's a bit more different experientially or phenomenologically. And then participatory knowing. And for me, this is probably, in the religious sense, this is important because, I was being very critical of the church and all that, but, it's important that religion is a experiential practice. It is, religion isn't sitting in front of a camera and philosophizing all day. That's a part of religion, but religion also has the practice of going to a church, a temple, whatever that entails. Therefore, we are in the story, we are in the narrative, we are in the practice. We aren't a outsider, so to speak, just like an armchair critique, just observing what's going on. No, we are involved in it, and that is what religion entails. So, look, one would even say, actually, I'm pretty sure John Vervaeke says this in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. That too, let me just quickly show it. This lecture series here, which is really, really good. I watched all 50 episodes. It's fantastic. He talks about how that religion itself, language, religion, many things are psychotechnologies. These are ways that we've done and developed to live in an embodied world, because we are embodied beings. And more from a literary perspective, I also want to kind of make this point that we become what we do. So if we act like we believe in God, we actually believe in God. It's better off acting like one believes in God and not even talking about it, than saying you believe in God and not really embodying that statement and living it out existentially. So literary, in a literary sense, I'd say in literature you could take Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, very, very good story where Raskolnikov, what happens to him when he commits the crime. But I thought, instead of referring to Dostoevsky, I'd actually talk about Breaking Bad, because for me, Breaking Bad is one of the best shows ever made. I mean, obviously, it's highly acclaimed. And I think Vince Gilligan, with the character Walter White, went even one step further than Dostoevsky did with Crime and Punishment, because in Crime and Punishment, it's more about, I wouldn't even say remorse, but it's more about, I think the best way to put it is when life replaces theory. So Raskolnikov has this idea that he is the Superman or like a Napoleon, where moral laws or the moral reality doesn't apply to him. He transcends reality and morality in some sense, and therefore he does the crime, and he believes that he could, because he did the crime for a good cause, intellectually, that he can sort of, let's say, transcend whatever he's gonna feel, and he's gonna be beyond what applies to the average person, so to speak. But that's not the case. He goes completely insane towards the end of the novel and finally confesses his love to Sonia, and confesses his crime too. But in Breaking Bad, Walter White continuously does crime, and Walter White tries this thing where he tries to, become a meth cook and a drug kingpin and separate his work from home. So he thinks that he could just, at one point of his life, become a meth cook, a drug dealer, become a criminal mastermind, and then the other part of his life, he could just merely become a suburban dad, or like a very, normal, average, middle class person. And it clearly doesn't work that way. It shows how he goes from this rather timid, soft-spoken individual to a pretty much almost like a criminal sociopath. Like he just ends up murdering people, and he becomes responsible for the death of his own brother-in-law. And I think that's that show, the narrative there, it just so clearly shows how we actually become what we do. And obviously, even though I'm talking about Crime and Punishment and Breaking Bad, it's not just in the case of the bad things or the immoral things one does. It's even in the good things, in the virtuous things. Therefore, if we get into the practice of doing good, I think we become good. It sounds like a very banal statement, but just think about it. Just think about it. And which is why, a big part of this idea of what I call the atheist prayer, or praying to God even if you don't know or praying to God even if you don't believe God exists, is this verse in the Old Testament that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. Now, a lot of people talk about that being humility, but for me, that isn't just humility. It definitely is humility, but let me try and flesh out that point. The fear of the Lord is actually an act of worship. It's a act of reverence, and it's a bit more different to merely being humble. And the thing about humility is, even humility can become narcissistic. It can become a way that vanity manifests itself. Even humility, a so-called virtue, can, in a very paradoxical way, become something vain, become something negative, become something self-serving, become something actually harmful. One of my friends shared this quote by Joseph Conrad. He says, "Vanity, that finest form of egoism, which can take on the aspect of every virtue." So let me read that again. Actually, let me just share my screen. Right here, vanity, that finest form of egoism, which can, on the aspect of vanity, that finest form of egoism, which can take on the aspect of every virtue. So, this is a really, really perspicacious take on the idea of vanity, because, yes, being compassionate is good. Being for, freedom is a good thing. Trying to emancipate people is a good thing. Humility is a good thing. But all these so-called virtues, in some sense, can turn one around, or turn itself around and become vain, become self-serving, become hubristic. But worship is a bit different, because in worship, one isn't worshipping an ideal value per se, but rather one is worshipping the summum bonum, the amalgamation of all these values. And it's this whole, this synthesis. I'm not being Hegelian here, but this synthesis of all these values, because I think that's, in many ways, if God is the ultimate, if God is the summum bonum, at least what God represents is the synthesis of all these values. So one isn't just worshipping humility. One is also worshipping courage. One is also worshipping love and respect and all. Actually, I'm not gonna put love in the lot with the others, because I think love is beyond all those other categories. It's a whole other point. Now, the best video I've seen so far, or the best take I've heard on this, is by Jonathan Pageau, where he talks about the difference between heaven and utopia, because he talks about what that entails. And for me, in some sense, when I mean, this could even be replaced, the difference between heaven and, let's say, humility or virtue, or let's put it this way. This title could even be rephrased to the key difference between heaven and a virtuous society. What does that mean? Because obviously, we want people to be virtuous, but that's a bit different to living in a heavenly state, so to speak. Let's watch the video.
I want to talk a little bit about heaven. So I talked to Matt Ridley a while back and Bjorn Lomborg, and I'm interested in their thinking because they're trying to plot an optimistic course for the future, one where at the highest levels of social integration, we decide how human society should look, at least insofar as we conceptualize how it might look if we addressed some of the major problems that beset us. But it's an attempt to make things better. It's an attempt to bring about something increasingly resembling heaven on earth. I mean, heaven is generally conceptualized. You can conceptualize it as a state of being. It might be the state of being that those people that you described live in. I've had paradisal experiences where everything transformed itself into something that was perfect, that appeared perfect. And I was unable to stay in those frames of mind. The heaven, is that something we build? Is that something? I don't understand the relationship between the heaven that awaits us, let's say, after we die. That's the idea, and what we build here on earth. Do those touch? Is that the doctrine? There's so much of this doctrine I don't understand at all.
I think a way to see it has to do with attention again, and it has to do with a hierarchy of attention. If you try to build heaven, you're going to fail. You're going to fail miserably because you're not aiming high enough, right? You're aiming, and then you get stuck in these weird world of opposites that you don't even understand the side effects of what you're doing, And so for one person, heaven will look like if everything could be perfectly ordered, then, right? And then we know what that looks like. And another person will look at heaven and think if everything could be free, if we could all just be free, and then that we know what that looks like. And so the idea is to look higher. There's a story that I've been
we have to strive for something better, but then we end up in, which is what you're saying, is that we end up with the Tower of Babel, or we end up with the flood, or we end up with the continual catastrophe of unintended consequences. But as you yourself said, we are aiming for something better. And so the question is, how do you pursue utopia while avoiding the pitfalls? And that's a theological question, I would say.
Yeah, it is. And I think I know people are going to hate that I say this, but it has to do with worship. It has to do with what you worship. So if you worship those things that you're aiming towards, the lower things, if you worship the making a safer society, if you worship the making a freer society, if you worship making a stronger society, all of these things are going to go off the rails because they have unintended consequences that you don't understand, because they're a fragment of reality. They need to be encompassed together in order to reach something higher. And so
that's the danger of ideology. It's the part takes the place of the whole.
So the idea is that if you worship God, then those other things will kind of lay themselves out slowly, and you won't be able to force them. They'll kind of lay themselves out slowly, and they'll start to manifest, progressively, and but you have to attend to the highest, or else, like I said, and there's an image of Antichrist which is related to this problem. In Scripture, one of the first Antichrists you could say was Judas, who betrayed Christ. Well, there's a story with Judas which is very fascinating, because Christ doesn't talk to Judas very often. But one of the places where Christ talks to Judas is when a woman comes in and wants to anoint and wash Christ's feet with a very expensive perfume.
Yep.
And then Judas says, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? Why don't we give this to the poor, right? And Christ says, the poor will always be with you, but the bridegroom, Christ, the Messiah, is there for a short time. And
yes,
so
that's the other kind of story. It's very difficult to understand how anyone could have invented that story. Like, it's not the story of propagandists.
No.
In fact, it's the opposite.
Yeah. But that story has to do with attention. So Christ obviously isn't saying you shouldn't help the poor. Christ has said to help the poor. He said it many times. You have to help the poor, give to the poor, of course. But he's saying get your hierarchy in order.
And you'll help the poor more effectively that way
right.
than any other. That's the case. That is the case.
So it's like it starts with worship, and the acts that she's doing, if you look at what she's doing, first of all, she bought something expensive. She's sacrificing it. She's sacrificing it to bow down and to wash the feet, to submit, to sacrifice to, and to worship. So those three things, like when I talk about the aim, how you end up having to submit to that aim. And so so Christ is saying, first comes worship, then the world lays itself out below that in an appropriate way. And that's
what the Sermon on the Mount says too.
Yeah. And those that are saying help the poor as their ultimate goal, in Scripture it says that Judas didn't even want to help the poor. He wanted to take the money for himself, really. Like, he was a thief, actually, and he was taking the money out of the purse. And so those that just want to reduce...
Well, I suppose the truth of the matter is that
Anyways, I don't want to get through the whole video, but you kind of get the point there, what Jonathan Pageau was trying to say. He's trying to say that we can't elevate a single value to be the ultimate value, because that simply doesn't work. And I think I agree with him. For starters, I think a lot of the time when we elevate a single value as a very, let's say, enclosed singular value to be the ultimate value of not just our individual selves, but even societally, when we elevate a single value, like let's say safety, for example, it either becomes for individual level hubristic and vain and egotistical, or it becomes totalitarian when it comes to like a societal level. And I think that's why, when that verse in Scripture says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, that isn't merely about humility. It's something a bit more than that. Humility is a part of it, as Jonathan Pageau said. In the hierarchical structure, humility is there, but it's not just that. It's fear of the Lord is also understanding what the Lord entails or what the Lord is. So, this is interesting. One thing I do like about Derrida is I watched a couple of Jacques Derrida's interviews, and whenever an interviewer asks him a question, he breaks down the question. He tries to, deconstruct the question itself and trying to understand what the question truly means. So obviously, in this video, when I make such a statement, an atheist's prayer, or why you should pray to God even if you're an atheist, let's say, it's important to deconstruct and break that down. I think I've tried to a certain extent my best, I'd say, at least at this level, to do that. However, maybe the best way to articulate my why, per se, as to why I think this is a good thing and this is something we should all strive towards doing, is simply to talk about my personal and subjective experience. And it's simply this: practically, the way I live as if God exists, the way I live like I even call it a Christian absurdist, is that I, first of all, treat people as if they're absolutely children of God, that there's something divine about them, that they're made in God's image, and I give to my best extent. I shouldn't, flatter myself too much or pat myself too much on the back, not to be overly self-laudatory, let's say, but I try my best to treat people like they're made in God's image, and I take that seriously. I don't take that as just some abstract idea. I try to embody that. And then most times, I'd say 3-4 times a day, it could be while I'm working, I just close my eyes and I ask, it's a prayer. It really is a prayer. I don't know what else it is, God, what do you want me to do with my life? What do you want me to do? Actually, I don't even say, what do you want me to do with my life? I just say, what should I do in the next couple of hours? How do you want me to live this day? It's a very practical thing, and simply asking that question. And I don't even say, God, make me more humble, make me more wise, even though sometimes that too is a part of my prayer. But most of the time, it is opening myself up to the eternal, to the ultimate, and listening and asking what is required from me. And as Jonathan Pageau said, one has to truly do it you can't take my word for it. One has to do it. This isn't something I can prove, let's say, empirically, except if it happens in your own life or my own life. Whatever is supposed to manifest, and I think something divine does manifest in your life. And that's why, I believe that all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs, should act, live, and even pray like God exists, even though he might not. Thanks for watching.